It's an honor to be on here with the people that you've already recruited to speak. Um, and I have to really kind of widen things out a little bit just to provide a little context, not historical context, recent history. Let's go back to 2014, something Americans don't know, but we did a coup d'etat in Kiev, the West did. Um, in the process, the orchestrators of this coup d'etat were intercepted in a telephone conversation en clair. That was revealed 2.5 weeks before the coup. They went ahead anyway. And when doubts were expressed with respect to how the EU would look at this, the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, said, F the EU. You know what the F word is. Okay, that was 2014. Now, 2015, something really unusual happened. You have to understand that by then, the intelligence community had pretty much been politicized. We know the situation with Iraq, where there were no weapons of mass destruction, there were no ties between Saddam Hussein and Al Qaeda. Well, the Defense Intelligence Agency came up with an annual report that speaks volumes. Let me read just one short paragraph of it. This is signed by Lieutenant General Vincent Stewart, who is the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Quote, the Kremlin is convinced the United States is laying the groundwork for regime change in Russia. A conviction further reinforced by what just happened in Ukraine. Moscow views the United States as the critical driver behind the crisis in Ukraine and believes that the overthrow of former Ukrainian President Yanukovych is the latest move in a long-established pattern of U.S. orchestrated regime change efforts, period, end quote. Wow! Somehow the New York Times missed this. It's right out there. This is what the head of the DIA said. Okay, so that's 2015. 2016. Now, here's a question for those of you who are paying attention, and I'd ask all of you to pay attention. I have a question to you. This issue was raised in 2016, and it was said by a very prominent U.S. politician. And my question to you is, can you identify which politician there was? Are you ready? Here you go. Ukraine is a core Russian interest, but not an American one. So Russia will always be able to maintain escalatory dominance there. Who said that? His name was Obama, okay? Barack Obama. He was president, and, vice president was a fellow named Biden. Now, is Russia unable to exercise escalatory dominance, to use a fancy word, still? Well, it is, okay? And that's the background of all this. The Russians have to decide whether they can do a deal, whether they can make some kind of deal with the United States, really, not with Zelensky. He's just a puppet. And that brings me to the real question here, and that is, are the Russians prepared to do a deal? Are there any glimmers of hope? Well, number one, background, escalatory dominance, so to speak, Russia. Okay? You don't have to be a army intelligence analyst, as I was for 2 years, to understand when you look at the you look at the map and you look at the weaponry and you look at the stakes involved, existential for Russia, not so much for the United States, as this fellow Barack Obama said. Well, you get the picture here, okay? So what am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about just today, we have Reuters reporting that Mr. Putin is asking his generals, what do you think we should do now in Ukraine? I mean, hello, let's have some suggestions. Well, what does that mean? What's the message there, for God's sake? The message there is I, Vladimir Putin, and my senior advisors have not decided whether to go through and clean out the rest of southern Ukraine, take Odessa, and go all the way to the Romanian border. We haven't decided that yet. Okay? What does that mean? Well, it means to this fellow that there's room for negotiation. You know, there's always been that great big river, the Dnieper, goes through Ukraine. Would the Russians stop before taking Odessa? Well, there is another indication that they might. What do I mean? Well, the Russians have always communicated, even during the Soviet days, in what was called esoteric communications. Sounds fancy, huh? Not fancy. You just look at what they said yesterday and you compare it to what they say today. Okay. What are they saying today? Well, not many people hung around for Putin's major address at Valdai on the 28th of October. But if they did, they would have heard the penultimate question, which was raised by, seemed to be a canned question to me, maybe not. In any case, the questioner said, "Hey, I'm thinking of visiting Odessa. Do you think I should apply for a Ukrainian or for a Russian passport?" Pretty cute, huh? Now, Putin answered and said, "Odessa, that beautiful city set up by Catherine the Great. Odessa could be a Яблоко раздора, Russian for an apple of discord." We talked a little bit about Greek mythology now. Those of you who know your mythology know what started the Trojan War, for God's sake. Яблоко раздора, the apple of discord, or it could be the easing into a situation where we could attenuate these grievances and, in other words, make a deal. Now, has anybody noticed that? Well, nobody reads. If Putin speaks more than an hour, they don't listen anymore, right? Okay, but McGovern listens, and people in my trade used to listen. Used to what McGovern did: listen, watch, print it out. It came to 23 pages. All right. Now, is that a hint? Well, this is how Russians do hint things when there's no communication going on with the people like Blinken or Sullivan, where for whatever reason they can't get it through their heads or can't even detect a broad hint. There's a hint for you. So, what am I saying? I'm saying that the Russians are, in my view, and you can take this for what it's worth. Uh, Please remember that I've been watching Russian leaders for a half century. Um, the Russians may be prepared to talk. They know that Zelensky is on a tight tether and that only Washington can get them to talk. But what Putin is saying today is, hey, today, I'm talking to my generals. So what do you think we should do? In other words, would we stop before Odessa? Now, realize that if the Russians take Odessa, Ukraine becomes a basket case, literally, a breadbasket for the rest of Europe, no access to the sea. It becomes a landlocked, whatever you want to call it, okay? So it's the end of Ukraine in anything like we're used to seeing Ukraine. My view is that for the right give and take, the right quid pro quo, Putin would stop before Odessa. It's right on the Dnieper. Let the Ukrainians have access to the sea, but in return for which the territorial conquests that the Russians have made would be part of the deal. And maybe a demilitarized zone going right down the river would do. There are possibilities for negotiation. Now, how about the Pope? Now, I'm a Catholic, and I like some of the things the Pope does and some of the things he says, but I don't agree with all of them. I think he's sort of like a cafeteria Christian, but on matters of war and peace, I think he's got it right. Why do I say that? Well, In 2015, he was invited to address a joint session of the U.S. Congress. What did he do? He got up there and he said, you know, the main problem, this is a quote, okay? The main problem today are the blood drenched arms traders. And senators, representatives alike got up, pop, and then looked in their pockets to see if the latest envelope from Lockheed was there, the one from Raytheon over here. It was giving hypocrisy a bad name, for God's sake. The Pope, he had it right. He knows what's going on, and his better counsels, the ones that give him the right scoop on things, um, have been able to get him to come down on the right side of things. So, what am I saying here? I'm saying here that he had some better counsel after he said those idiot remarks about some ethnic Russians being the most fierce, the most cruel people fighting in Ukraine. He apologized for that. Now, wait a second. McGovern, come on. Pope apologized? Pope said he was wrong? Come on. It took him, what, 6 or 7 centuries to apologize for being wrong about Galileo? Come on. Well, he did. He did within days. What did Russia say? The next day, Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman got up and said, whoa, the Pope has apologized for saying that idiot thing that he said about such cruelty on the Russian part. What does that tell you? Well, you know, these things don't happen in a vacuum. In other words, I think Helga and others, Veterans for Peace, among others, who are calling for negotiation, a Christmas truce, for God's sake, a Christmas ceasefire, you know, that they have it right, that hit the nail right on the head. And there's history behind this. I mean, after all, when you look at popes, it's hard to say. You look at World War II, and you look at the churches that could not find their voice. You look at Pius XII. Well, there's a lot to atone for, all right? And maybe, just maybe, Francis will face into it this time and say, look, I can use my good offices. Could be at the Vatican, could be in Odessa, could be anywhere. But I'd like to get Russians, Ukrainians together, knowing all the while that the Ukrainians will be listening through their earpiece to what the Americans tell them, but get them together. Now, why do I say that this is so necessary for the Pope to do this? Well, I mentioned World War II. I mentioned the papal behavior during World War II, where the church could not find its voice. I want to mention something that not many people know. It has to do with Albert Camus, the French philosopher. After the war, and when I say war, I mean World War II, okay? You could tell what war it is, okay, by the color of my hair. After World War II, some very thoughtful and progressive Dominicans invited Albert Camus to their monastery. They wanted to ask him his impressions of what the church behavior during the war really meant for civilization. Now, Camus, of course, was a atheist or an agnostic, but Camus, to his credit, agreed to come to the monastery. And I'd like to read just a few sentences of the little speech that he gave. Camus. For a long time during the frightful years of the war, I waited for a great voice to speak up in Rome. I, an unbeliever? Precisely, for I knew that the spirit would be lost if it did not utter a cry of condemnation when faced with force and brutality. It seems that the voice in Rome did speak up, but I assure you that millions, like me included, did not hear it. And at that time, believers and unbelievers alike shared a solitude that continued to spread as the days went by and the executioners multiplied. It has been explained to me since that the condemnation was indeed voiced, but that was in the style of an encyclical. An encyclical, which is not at all clear. The condemnation was voiced, and it was not understood. Whose fault was that? End quote. Last part of this particular letter from Camus. This is excerpted from something called Resistance, Rebellion, and Death, Essays. Camus. What I know, which sometimes creates a deep longing in me, what I know is that if Christians made up their mind to it, millions of voices, millions, I say, throughout the world, would be added to the appeal of a handful of us, without any sort of affiliation, to intercede today almost everywhere and ceaselessly for the children and for the people. Diane spoke about Madeleine Albright's dismissive attitude toward the 500,000 children in Iraq who perished because of the sanctions. Albright said on air to Leslie Stahl, yeah, it was worth it. It was hard, but yeah, it was worth it. Now, somebody has to stop killing the children. Somebody has to listen to a little Roger Waters. It's necessary to stop killing the children anymore. Now, I have to tell you that there's a time element here. Dr. King said a lot of things, but one that leaps out in my mind is that there is such a thing as too late. I want to give you an example of someone who, like Pius XII, kept his counsel, didn't speak out. He was a professor at the University of Berlin. His name was Albrecht Haushofer. Okay, now he was a geolog, geologist. Okay, and he got tenure, and a lot of you know what it takes to get tenure. Okay, he got tenure because he kept his mouth shut during the worst of it. Now, toward 1943, 1944, he had a conscience, and his conscience got to him. He started speaking out against Hitler, and he actually gathered quite a following. So he was wrapped up before the Allies came into Germany and put in a prison, just like other dissidents of this kind. Now, the point of this is what Haushofer did. In the prison in which he was put, they shot you. They didn't hang you. And so before they would shoot him, they said, now, Albrecht, you have to sign a confession. Confession? Give me a break. I'm not going to fight it. You just shoot me, will you? No. This very orderly. We have to sign the confession. See? So he said, I'm not going to do that. And they shot him. Okay. But as they picked him off the floor, a little zettel, a little piece of paper came out from his pocket. Okay. And on it was his confession. It was in the form of a sonnet in German. Very brief. I'll read it to you. The title was Schuld, Guilt. Doch bin ich schuldig, aber anders als ihr denkt. Yeah, I was Yeah, I'm guilty, but it's not what you're thinking. Ich musste früher meine Pflicht erkennen. I should have earlier recognized my duty. Ich musste schärfer Unheil nennen. I should have more sharply called evil. Habe ich zu lang gelenkt. Mein Urteil habe ich zu lang gelenkt. I put off my judgment far too long. Ich habe gewarnt. I did warn, aber nicht genug. Enough, okay? Nicht genug und klar. With claro, I mean, there's no comparative in German for klar. Klar is klar, okay? Ich habe gewarnt, aber nicht genug und klar. Und heute weiß ich, was ich schuldig war. And today I know what I was guilty of. I warned, but not enough, and not clearly enough. And now I know what I was guilty of. Well, there are people warning. And there are prophets out there. And all we have to do is kind of listen to them and to follow their lead. Now, I have two people I would like to cite here. And then I'll spare you the rest. One is my favorite theologian and poet, Annie Dillard. What Annie says is, it's really up to us. This is a quote. There's only us, but there are enough of us. We should amass half-dressed in long lines like tribesmen and shake gourds at each other to wake up. Instead, we watch television and we miss the show. Chavez gives us hope. Chavez always said before any action, including the wonderful grape boycott. I remember buying some grapes during those days, and my wife almost killed me. She's like, "What's going on with you?" Okay, the grape boycott and others. He said, "Look, we're going to do this," and not all, but most of us, no, we can't do that. There aren't enough of us. And Chavez said, "Look, there are enough of us, but without action, without doing these things, nothing's going to happen." So let me end on that note. Let's make it so we don't kill the children anymore. No, nobis pacem, dona nobis pacem. Thanks.